This morning we are continuing with our sermon series, HYMNstory, in which we are looking at some of the history and story behind some of the most well-known hymns in our Christian tradition. Somehow these words and these tunes, written in some cases hundreds of years ago, still manage to touch our heart, to have great meaning for us, but it has an even greater meaning sometimes when we know more of the story behind them. So far we've looked at the church's one foundation, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, and last week we talked about Amazing Grace, and this morning we are looking at the number one funeral hymn in America, It Is Well With My Soul. Actually, it's probably a tie between It Is Well With My Soul and How Great Thou Art, but we'll get to that one next week. Side note, my mother-in-law, when she was getting ready to enter the last phase of her life, said, "Whatever you do, don't sing It Is Well With My Soul at my funeral." Too many ladies have oversung that song too much at too many funerals. So I enter this with trepidation. So why is this song so often sung at funerals in the United States? Well, there is something about the lyrics that speaks deeply to the heart of grieving, while at the same time clinging to the hope of our faith. And those two things are often part of the grieving process for many people when they lose someone they love. The grief part makes sense when we look at the history of It Is Well With My Soul. This was a hymn that was born out of deep, deep grief. This morning we're going to hear the heartbreaking tale of Horatio Spafford. If you're looking for a name for your child, don't choose that one. Horatio Spafford, you may not know his name, but this is one of the few hymns that actually has a somewhat famous or infamous story behind its writing. So you may have heard some of this before. Horatio Spafford was a successful businessman and lawyer in Chicago in the 1800s. He was a devout Christian. He was a leader in his Presbyterian church, a layperson, but he was well respected by everyone who knew him. To say things were going well for the Spaffords would be an understatement. Horatio was incredibly successful in his business. He and his wife Anna had a loving marriage. They had 5 children, 1 boy and 4 girls. Things were going very, very well for them. But then in 1871, the world came crashing down. The Chicago fire of 1871 decimated Horatio's business. The real estate investments that he'd made along the shore of the Great Lakes literally went up in smoke. He was down, but not out. Over the next year, he rebuilt his business from the ground up, and things were starting to look good again. But just as things were turning around, the Spafford's only son died of scarlet fever. 2 years later, with his family still in deep mourning, Anna, his wife, and he decided that they would take a trip to England to recuperate, to work through some of the grief that they were feeling after this incredible loss. Now, again, we are reminded of the danger of transatlantic travel in this time period. I told you last week that there seems to be something about almost dying on a ship that creates a great conversion moment, amazing Christians. And the good news is that in the last minutes before he was supposed to leave, Horatio's business kept him at home, and he could not travel at the time that he originally planned. He wasn't on the boat. But the bad news is that Horatio sent his wife and his 4 daughters on ahead of him with the plan that he would meet them in England a few days later. 4 days into the trip, on November 22nd, the ship carrying Horatio's family collided with an iron-hulled Scottish ship called the Loch Earn. Their ship sank in 12 minutes. Horatio's wife Anna was pulled from the Atlantic unconscious, clinging to a piece of floating wreckage. And when her rescuers brought her to Wales 9 days later, she cabled Horatio a message that said, "Saved alone. What shall I do?" All 4 of their daughters, Annie, Margaret Lee, Bessie, and Toretta, had perished when the ship sank. In the span of 3 years, they had lost all 5 of their children. Horatio told his wife to wait in England, and he boarded a ship to join her there. 4 days into his own journey, the captain of the ship said they were entering the area of the sea where his family's ship had gone down. And as they passed over this area, he penned the words that we sang this morning. It is well with my soul. When sorrow like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. How amazing is this hymn in light of the Spaffords' loss, their story. I've known far too many people in 15 years of ministry who have endured terrible loss and somehow shown amazing faith and strength on the other side of it. Some of these stories are present here in this church in our 9 o'clock service and here with us at the 11 o'clock service. As we gather together on Sunday morning, it's hard to ignore the fact that there are spouses and children and parents and siblings who aren't here, that there are miscarriages and losses we have endured together. The amount of loss present just here in this room is a heavy load to bear. And yet, more often than not, it seems that a stronger faith comes out the other side. I always hope that if I or our family was in the same situation, that we would have the same strength that some of you have shown. So I've sat with the grieving, so often the words of Psalm 46, which Mary was kind enough to read for us, echo through the room. God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in times of trouble. And God is indeed a refuge, a safe place, a sanctuary in the midst of the deepest pain, a place where we can hide and retreat to. In fact, as we gathered together yesterday to talk about the mission of the church, those were some of the words that kept coming up as people described Monte United Methodist Church: an oasis, a refuge, a sanctuary, a place where hurt people can find strength again and recuperate and find the will to continue on. So often it seems that grieving people don't even know how they keep going, how they're still standing, relying on a strength that is no longer just their own. Even as everything changes, even as the firm ground beneath their feet is shaken, even when it feels like they're drowning in grief, God is there with them. We believe that. Somehow, miraculously, God often pulls them closer, teaches them to trust more. And I wish it was always the case. It's not. There are always those who still feel abandoned and lost and alone. There are people who feel angry at God for the loss they've experienced. And if you're one of those, that's okay. God can handle it. But I'm amazed that more often than not, it seems that there is a deep trust, a lifeline that people hold on to when they too feel lost at sea, that God has not left them. And that brings us to what happens after loss. The ability to trust in God is not always easy, and sometimes the faithful, the church, the people who are called to be the most supportive, the most compassionate, the most loving, fail horribly at it. When Horatio and Anna Spafford finally returned home to Chicago, they sought comfort in their faith. They returned to their church family looking for consolation, for love, for compassion. But their church, which is steeped in a deep theology of predestination, that everything happens for a reason, that God causes both the good and the bad to happen, regarded the loss of their daughters as some type of divine judgment for their sin. Can you imagine that? After trying and failing to get the pastor of the church removed, go Horatio, the Spaffords left the church. But they didn't just leave the church, they left their home. They left their country. They moved to Jerusalem and began a new life. They leaned into their faith and away from the church, and they began a philanthropic work there in Jerusalem among the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims. Their efforts were not to try to convert people to Christianity, but instead to reveal Christian witness through their actions. And this time, 2 more children were born to the Spaffords. And they continued that work throughout the rest of their lives. As I learned the story of Horatio and Anna Spafford, I couldn't help but think of the story of Job from the Old Testament. The losses that both men endured are very, very similar. A loss of fortune, a loss of property, a loss of children. And yet neither one of them, neither Horatio nor Job, is willing to deny God. As awful as things get, as horrible as their circumstances become, they do not turn away from God. They somehow maintain their faith in the midst of horrendous loss, in spite of the fact that their faith communities do everything they can to make things worse. I have a picture on one of the shelves in my office. I rescued it from a molding Sunday school classroom in a United Methodist church in Galesville, Alabama that had closed. It's a picture of Job sitting in the dirt in his sackcloth and ashes. It's from a children's Sunday school classroom, so they leave off the boils and the awful skin condition that Job had to endure. But sitting there in front of Job as he sits in the dirt looking at the ground are the three friends that gather around Job in his time of trial. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, 3 more names not to consider for your children. Scripture tells us that they sat there for 3 days with Job in silence. That's what the picture's of. Job sitting there and 3 friends. In fact, one of them, I'm going to say it's Bildad, is actually covering his mouth. And he should have kept his hand there. But instead, he decides to fill the silence. Have you ever known someone like that? Someone who just can't stand the sound of silence, so they have to try and fill it up with words. I'm one of those people. You may be one of those people too, where you just try to fill it up with words. It doesn't matter what you say. You just want it to be. No dead air. I'm learning. I'm getting better. That's why I keep that picture in my office, actually. It's to remind myself to listen more than I talk. One mom in a previous church often told her 3 children, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth so you could listen twice as much as you talk. Job's 3 friends were being very helpful, very kind, very compassionate by just sitting with him in silence. But then they had to open their mouths. Questions started pouring out like, Job, what did you do to deserve this? Come on, Job, surely you did something really awful for God to treat you in this way. You know, history is there to teach us not to repeat the mistakes of the past. We should learn from those mistakes, but it seems that we are often more prone to repeat them. Those words of blame and accusation that touched Job's ears echoed down through the generations and landed smack dab on Horatio Spafford's ears as well, when he experienced that same judgment from his church. Where rather than reaching out in compassion and love to a couple who was grieving the loss of 5 children, they received nothing but condemnation. Blame for a horrible tragedy that was beyond their control, certainly not something that a loving God would make happen. Who can blame them for leaving the church behind them? The question that I think rests on my heart and my mind is, how can we as a church do a better job of not repeating the mistakes of the past? How can we cause less grief to those who know loss and pain? How can we look at the stories of Job and of Horatio and Ann Spafford and see that there's a different way that we can be as a church as we try to comfort those who are grieving? Because most families I have known in the midst of deep grief are clinging to those words that we read from Psalm 46. They want to know that God is still with them. They want to know that God is present in the midst of these times of trouble, that he is never going to abandon them. And sometimes it's a tenuous grasp. Sometimes they are just barely holding on. And what they don't need is well-meaning Christians bombarding them with bad hallmark theology, telling them, oh, there's a reason this happened. Oh, God just needed another angel. Oh, it was just his time or her time. It's the reason I often tell grieving families before the visitation begins or before the funeral service begins to prepare themselves. Because someone that you love is going to say something unintentionally awful to you. They're going to try really hard to comfort you, and they are going to fail so spectacularly that you're going to want to punch them in the face hard. Just remember, they're trying to be nice. Because they don't know what to say, they're just going to say everything that they've ever heard in a movie or at a funeral, or that they've heard a pastor egregiously say from a pulpit, that they think is going to make you feel better. But what they aren't thinking about is what that sounds like to you. The grieving one, the hurting one. The one who needs God more than anything right now. The one who needs the church to act like the church. A bit of advice from your pastor. I have learned that there are only two things that you need to say as you talk to someone who has lost someone. I am so sorry, and we love you. That's it. Then your job is just to be with them, not to fill the silence with more and more words. One of the things that we talked about yesterday as we gathered together around this concept of building a new mission statement for our church was how this church reaches out in love to those who have been hurt, spiritually wounded, how that deep woundedness can come from rejection and judgment and exclusion for any number of different reasons. As we went around the room talking about how people came to the church and why they stayed, those stories of woundedness came up again and again. We tried 16 churches before we came to Monte. I was told again and again that I would never make it if my spouse didn't come with me to worship. Again and again, those words echoed through, and they said, but here I found home. You know, grief sometimes is more than just loss. We have an opportunity to lean into the hurt that all the Eliphazes and Bildads and Zophars caused and say, there is still a safe place. There is still a refuge. There is still a sanctuary where you will be loved and comforted and accepted and challenged to grow as a disciple of Jesus Christ. Doesn't mean we're not going to make mistakes. We're human. We're Methodist. You've got a pastor who's just barely hanging on most of the time. But you know what? We're going to try. We're going to do what we are called to do. And I'm so proud of the work of that group of people that gathered together yesterday. Because they committed to those ideas of hospitality and welcome, of acceptance and affirmation, of love and faith that we believe are so important and so integral to who we are as a church family. They said, you know what we believe the mission of the church should be? That Monte Sano United Methodist Church welcomes all to grow in love and faith through Christ. Monte Sano United Methodist Church welcomes all to grow in love and faith through Christ. These are the things that make us who we are. That sense of welcome, that great love, that call to grow as disciples. As we move forward into the next weeks and months and years together, we have a purpose, a chance to be the people that God is calling us to be a refuge, a sanctuary in the midst of the storm that doesn't leave you where you were, hurt and broken, but instead challenges you to rise and grow and go out and share this wonderful faith through service and love as we grow in love and faith together. You know, whatever happens denominationally, I've said this before and I'll say it again, it doesn't change who we are. You know, I'd love to tell you that your pastor had this grand plan that we were going to develop a mission statement right as the general conference was happening. It just kind of happened that way. But I think it's so important that we took this time to define who we are. Before maybe we were cast into the winds of uncertainty as a denomination. Who we are doesn't change. Who God has made us uniquely to be in the midst of all these wonderful churches that surround us is a church that welcomes all to grow in love and faith through Christ. I look forward to the years ahead of us as we continue to grow into this wonderful mission that your brothers and sisters have helped to craft for you, as we strive to be the church that God has called.